depended on its ability to combine tradition with innovation, but some recent forms of the genre experiment with its conventions more explicitly and more radically. In some narratives, the detective is no longer a figure in control, or someone on the side of good who has all the answers. Instead, in such narratives, the detective is thoroughly compromised, confused, and corrupt. Even though many examples of the genre are known for finishing with a strong sense of resolution, in which the mystery is cleared up and the criminal apprehended, experimental examples of the genre are often very open-ended, suggesting our inability to ever arrive at a secure or satisfactory answer to a mystery. This open-endedness is reflected in the fact that in these texts, it's acceptable for a reader to be left puzzled and uncertain at the story's conclusion. Some examples of traditional mystery and suspense fiction have always been hybrid, such as the Sherlock Holmes stories, many of which are as much adventure tales as they are puzzle mysteries. More recent experimental texts, however, often take this hybridity to another level by combining the accepted elements of the genre with those of other genres, including science fiction, fantasy, the thriller, and literary fiction. Nevertheless, we'll also see in this lecture that despite this hybridity, even the most experimental examples of mystery and suspense fiction are still in dialogue with, and both structured and influenced by, the formulaic traits that have been our focus throughout this series of lectures. And curiously, these experimental texts also tend to have another thing in common. None of them sell anywhere near as much as other types of mysteries. In trying to figure out why, we'll consider the possibility that despite everything, we want a resolution. We need the world to make sense, even though, or especially when, we know it often makes no sense at all. Considering that we'll be looking at texts in this lecture that don't seem to obey the rules of logic, it's ironic that there's a very logical place to begin our discussion. The work of the famed Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. As we saw in another lecture in this course, a 1980 novel by Italian writer Umberto Eco entitled The Name of the Rose, which is a fine example of experimental mystery fiction in its own right, contains a tribute to Borges in the form of the blind librarian Jorge of Burgos. Why is Borges considered to be such an influential figure by other writers who experiment with mystery and suspense fiction? The beginning of an answer to this question is to stress the importance of the symbol of the labyrinth in many of Borges's works. Sometimes these labyrinths are physical, sometimes they are metaphysical, but regardless of the form they take, they frequently symbolize the same thing in Borges's work: the complexity of the world and the folly of believing that one can interpret and understand that world by imposing any kind of pattern or logic onto it. With that image of intellectual folly, or even hubris in mind, we can begin to see why Borges might have been attracted to the idea of using a detective in his work. A great fan and student of the work of Edgar Allan Poe, Borges would definitely have been familiar with Poe's tales of ratiocination, the activity of analysis, and the character of Auguste Dupin. The classical detective's confidence about his ability to explain, order, and make sense of the world around him constitutes an irresistible target for Borges, because this is precisely the kind of certainty that he wants to critique and undermine. How does he do it? In his short story, Death and the Compass, published in 1942 and translated into English in 1954, Borges writes his own experimental and subversive version of the detective story. When a rabbi by the name of Marcel Yarmolinsky is murdered, Eric Lonhro, the story's detective, is assigned to investigate the case. Based upon a mysterious message found at the scene of the crime, Lonhro quickly convinces himself that the rabbi's death is part of a planned series of murders, a series that follows an elaborate pattern based on the Kabbalah that the erudite Lonhro believes he has figured out. Based on his theory, Lonhro stakes out a particular location in order to trap the killer, only to find out that he's the one who has walked into a trap. Lonhro is captured by Red Charlak, whose brother Lonhro had previously arrested. We learn that Charlak, having sworn to avenge his brother, was able to trap Lonhro by creating the appearance of a pattern to the murders. The rabbi was in fact killed by accident, but seeing an opportunity to get back at Lonhro, Charlak planted the mysterious message at the crime scene to trick the detective into believing in the existence of an elaborate scheme. Once Lonhro had accepted the appearance of that scheme as reality and acted accordingly, he was doomed. The story ends with Charlak killing Lonhro. What was Lonhro's mistake? Or to put the same question in a different way, according to Borges, what was the detective's mistake? To believe that the world was a comprehensible place that can be ordered and predictable. For forgetting the truth, which is that the world is chaotic, labyrinthine, and meaningless, the detective pays with his life. A harsh punishment for such a minor mistake, we might think, but doubtless a very effective way for Borges to undermine the confidence and certainty we usually associate with the figure of the detective. If the detective in Borges' story is undone by the sin of pride, the detective who appears in the equally experimental work of French writer Alain Robe-Grillet appears to be guilty through no fault of his own. The origins of Robe-Grillet's contribution to mystery narrative lies in the mid-1950s when, like a number of other French intellectuals of his generation who had been deeply influenced by the country's experiences in World War II, he began to cast philosophical doubt on the concepts of meaning and identity. According to Robe-Grillet, traditional forms of humanism were bankrupt because they assumed a depth to personality, nature, and the world as a whole that simply didn't exist. In other words, where others sought depth and a firm foundation upon which to build and make assumptions about reality, Robe-Grillet saw only instability, indeterminacy, and relativity. He and other writers with similar views, such as Nathalie Sarraut, Robert Pinget, and Marguerite Duras, began to put their ideas into practice in works that collectively became known as examples of the nouveau roman, or new novel. According to the critic John Fletcher, Robe-Grillet himself is in favor of a literature that is all on the surface, postulating nothing about what may or may not lie behind phenomena. Of a novel that presents characters with little or no previous history and without conventional names to identify them. Of a treatment of time which renders faithfully the achronological leaps of the imagination and the temporal distortions of memory and emotion, and of narrative which is not afraid of being inconsistent and reflecting a reality that has its own recurring bafflements. Given the existence of the nouveau roman and its defining ideas, why would a writer like Robe-Grillet be attracted to the concept of writing his own version of the detective novel? Precisely because the traditional form of that novel, from Robe-Grillet's point of view, exemplifies that depthful world in which meaning and identity are clear, or at least can be made clear. Just as Borges was looking to subvert the icon of the detective, Robe-Grillet was looking to subvert a genre that he believed epitomized the folly of believing in a world that contained certainty. How did he go about doing this? The answer to this question can be found in Robe-Grillet's 1953 novel Les Gommes, which was translated into English in 1964 with the title The Erasers. Robe-Grillet has claimed that his novel is faithful to the mystery genre. And in a limited sense, he's right. There's a murder, a detective, an investigation, red herrings, a strong feeling of suspense as the narrative unfolds, and by the end of the novel, the crime has been solved. But in another sense, Robe-Grillet is being deliberately disingenuous, because in The Erasers, none of these typical elements relate to each other in the way they usually do in an ordinary mystery novel. Most strikingly, Valis, the detective figure, turns out to be the murderer. Not through any fault of his own, but because he has been manipulated into this situation. By whom? For what purpose? Robe-Grillet drops some hints, but gives the reader no definitive answers to these questions. Just as Valis feels trapped in a situation that is under someone else's control, so the reader feels trapped inside Robe-Grillet's ingenious fictional creation. Instead of the comforting and enjoyable sense of completion and resolution that we usually feel at the end of a typical puzzle mystery, Robe-Grillet deliberately leaves us feeling frustrated and unsure. The places, people, and events in The Erasers appear to make sense, but upon closer inspection, they make no sense at all. The perfect example of the dilemma into which Robe-Grillet places the reader is the object the novel is titled after. Soon after arriving in the unnamed provincial town in which The Erasers is set, Valis buys an eraser from a stationery shop. Partly because of some confusing and incomplete information that Robe-Grillet gives us about it, the eraser acts as a symbol, or, to be more precise, as a clue. In this sense, it cries out to be interpreted, understood, and used in such a manner that it will help us solve the mystery. But Robe-Grillet makes it impossible for the reader to use the eraser in this way, because he doesn't give us enough information about it. This object is the perfect example of the way in which Robe-Grillet waves the typical features of mystery and suspense fiction in our face, while simultaneously emptying them of meaning. But why do this? Is Robe-Grillet's aim in The Erasers, and Borges' purpose in Death and the Compass, simply to annoy and frustrate us? Not at all. In fact, there's a curious and unexpected kinship between writers of conventional mysteries and those who write experimental mystery narratives. Both use the same set of generic conventions to educate their readers and make them think, but their pedagogic purposes are very different. As we've seen in other lectures in this series, when we looked at the puzzle mysteries of writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Agatha Christie, and Ellery Queen, part of the aim of these writers is to reassure their readers that despite the fact that the world has been temporarily disrupted by a violent crime, that world can be restored to order and made comprehensible again by the work of the detective. Borges and Robe-Grillet have a very different aim. They don't want to reassure us. They want to unsettle us, to force us to ask questions about those things we think we know, to have a more active and critical attitude to the world around us and the people in it. We may not always like being forced into reconsidering our relationship with reality, but potentially it's a valuable experience. We can see the same questioning attitude in the work of American writer Paul Auster. And once again, Auster uses the conventions of mystery and suspense fiction to ask the questions he wants his readers to contemplate. Auster's engagement with and admiration for the detective novel form began to appear early in his career. One of his first novels, Squeeze Play, written in 1978 and published under the name Paul Benjamin in 1982, is a more or less conventional detective story with a baseball theme. Even here, though, Auster is beginning to play with the conventions of the genre, as he later explained in his 1997 memoir, Hand to Mouth. One of the conventional plot gimmicks of these stories was the apparent suicide that turns out to have been a murder. I thought, why not reverse the trick and stand it on its head? Why not have a story in which an apparent murder turns out to be a suicide? Auster's next detective novels, however, would experiment with the genre's conventions in a much more radical manner. And the clue to how he does so comes in a statement Auster once made in an interview with Larry McCaffrey and Cinder Gregory. "Mystery novels always give answers. My work is about asking questions." The novels known as the New York trilogy ask questions rather than providing answers, and in the process they play with and revise mystery and suspense fiction quite substantially. The first novel in the trilogy, City of Glass, begins when Daniel Quinn, a writer of conventional detective fiction, gets a phone call from someone looking for Paul Auster of the Auster Detective Agency. Quinn hangs up, but when the person calls back later, Quinn pretends to be Paul Auster. Peter and Virginia Stillman hire Quinn, or Auster, to protect them from Peter's father, who is also called Peter and who has just been released from prison, where he'd been serving a sentence for locking his son in a room for 9 years as an experiment in language acquisition. Far from attempting to harm his son, however, the father spends his time roaming Manhattan collecting random items, again as a language experiment. This time, the father is attempting to generate or discover a language that will at last say what we have to say. Still pretending to be a detective, Quinn obsessively follows the father on his walks around the city and records all of the father's activities in a red notebook. Quinn even seeks out the real Paul Auster to get his advice about the case. But when he finds him, he discovers that Auster is a writer and not a detective. At the end of the novel, Quinn disappears, and we discover that another writer, who is a friend of Auster's, has used Quinn's red notebook to tell the story that is City of Glass. Given the experimental nature of City of Glass, Auster initially had problems finding a publisher for the novel. But Sun and Moon Press, a small company in Los Angeles, known for publishing innovative fiction, brought the novel out in 1985. It inspired widely divergent reactions from critics, with some hailing it as a work of genius, while others dismissed it as an esoteric and pointless experiment. The other two novels in the trilogy also inspired divergent reactions. Ghosts, published in 1986, also features a man hired to follow another man. But this novel is set in 1947 rather than present-day Manhattan. On the surface, the story is quite straightforward. As Auster explains at the start of the novel, the case seems simple enough. White wants Blue to follow a man named Black and to keep an eye on him for as long as necessary. Needless to say, things get much more complicated very quickly, as it becomes increasingly difficult to tell the characters apart from each other. Also published in 1986, and the final novel in the trilogy, The Locked Room takes up some of the subject matter and themes of the first two novels, such as a mysterious disappearance, an attempt to get inside the mind of another, and doubling. Indeed, toward the end of the novel, Auster himself draws attention to the similarities between the three novels in the trilogy when he has his narrator observe that the three stories are finally the same story, but each one represents a different stage, in my awareness, of what it's about. I don't claim to have solved any problems. I'm sure you'll agree that this last sentence is ominous for anyone trying to understand Auster's New York trilogy. But let's ask the question anyway. What is Auster trying to do in these novels? Lots of people have tried to answer the question, and indeed, the New York trilogy has attracted more critical attention than any of Auster's other works. The problem here isn't just that by trying to explain these novels, we feel we're falling into Auster's trap, but also, as Auster himself has pointed out, the criticism starts to overwhelm the novels themselves. Who cares about finding the right label for my books? To read these critics, my novels somehow become aesthetic tracts, when in fact they're stories about flesh and blood people. Contradictions abound. There's no one line of thought I'm pushing. Keeping Auster's words in mind, let's take a look at the New York trilogy from the point of view of our knowledge of mystery and suspense fiction and see what we find. As I mentioned earlier, throughout the trilogy, Auster makes extensive use of various conventions from the genre, including the detective, an investigation, disappearances, and questions of identity. In an ordinary mystery narrative, however, these conventions would eventually lead to some kind of resolution. I'm not saying that every example of mystery and suspense fiction always has a firm and unambiguous sense of resolution. Indeed, as we've seen in a number of other lectures in this course, even the most conventional mystery narratives can have a degree of open-endedness when it comes to their conclusions. Think, for example, of the fact that we still don't know for sure who the murderer is at the end of Edgar Allan Poe's The Mystery of Marie Roget, and you'll see what I mean. But at least conventional mystery narratives make some gesture toward resolution, rather than leaving things completely up in the air. Not so Auster. As we saw earlier, Auster has described his mystery novels as focusing more on asking questions than providing answers. And by the time we get to the final volume of the New York trilogy, we can see what he means. But again, we're compelled to ask why. What's the point? In my opinion, Auster sees value in taking a genre that's synonymous with providing answers to questions to give readers at least a temporary sense of resolution, and using that very same genre to instead ask questions without providing any answers. Why? Because it emphasizes the fact that we live in a world that's often stubbornly incomprehensible or senseless, a world in which we do not, in fact, experience the satisfaction of an answer. In the real world, just as in the New York trilogy, we often have to content ourselves with not knowing. From this perspective, we have to consider a startling possibility. Perhaps examples of experimental mystery and suspense fiction are among the most realistic examples of the genre we've encountered in this course. Only this type of narrative, it seems, respects the complexity and, yes, incomprehensibility of the world we actually live in. In other lectures in this course, we've often looked at examples of mystery and suspense narratives from other media, rather than focusing exclusively on print. With this in mind, I'd like to conclude this lecture by discussing a film that, although most people wouldn't think of it in this way, destabilizes the figure of the detective and turns it into something very different from the archetypal version of this figure that we first saw in the work of Edgar Allan Poe. When William Friedkin's 1980 film Cruising was released, it did poorly at the box office, partly because it had been dogged by controversy from the beginning, thanks to its representations of gay men, and partly because it was dismissed as nothing more than a cheap exploitation flick. While it is certainly sensationalistic and does contain stereotypical images of homosexuals, it is also a fascinating examination of the evolution of its detective protagonist over the course of the film. The story begins with a series of murders of gay men that have been taking place in Manhattan. Al Pacino stars as police detective Steve Burns, who, because he resembles the victims, is sent undercover into the city's gay subculture to see if he can find the killer. Initially very uncomfortable with this assignment, as the investigation proceeds, Burns begins to change. Not only does he feel more and more comfortable in this subculture, he also begins to side with gay men against the police when an incident of police brutality connected to the investigation takes place. By the end of the film, the murders have apparently been solved, but this is by no means a satisfactory or persuasive resolution for at least two reasons. First, we're not sure that the police have caught the right man. And second, we suspect that Burns himself may either have become a killer and/or is questioning his own sexual orientation. In the film's brilliant final shot, Burns is staring at himself in a mirror while shaving off the beard he grew while undercover. In the background, we can hear his girlfriend walking toward him. And we know she's wearing the distinctive clothes that Burns wore during the investigation. On the surface, Burns is now back to normal and has put the investigation behind him. But has he? What's going through his mind? The film refuses to answer these questions, and so we're struck by the difference between the detective Burns was at the start of the film, detached, professional, and objective, with the person he's become. Unlike Poe's Dupin, who began and ended each of his investigations as exactly the same person, Burns has clearly been changed profoundly by what he's gone through. By the time we get to a film like Cruising, it's clear that we've traveled a very long way from our starting points in this course. Edgar Allan Poe, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and Auguste Dupin. Instead of answers, we have questions. Instead of analysis, we have violence that only seems to beget more violence. And instead of a detective who is firmly in control, we have a detective who might well be losing control. We also have a narrative that, like most of the other narratives we've looked at in this lecture, didn't sell particularly well. Although experimental examples of mystery and suspense fiction may be well respected as aesthetic objects, they aren't popular with wide audiences. Why is this? Over the course of these lectures, we've encountered a fantastically wide variety of mystery and suspense narratives, including many that play with the conventions of the genre and sometimes frustrate our desire to see mysteries resolved. In the final analysis, however, it seems that we can only tolerate so much experimentation and frustration. Perhaps the ultimate secret to great mystery and suspense fiction is that, in one way or another, it satisfies a deep-seated desire we all have for the world around us to make sense. As the 21st century continues to unfold in all of its complexity and contradiction, it seems that in the future, mystery and suspense fiction, the genre we all love, is destined to become more important than ever.